I remember I ran a drill a number of years ago, and when I put all the employees in the room, so I was at a business. It was probably a medium sized company. We're talking about 75 to 100 employees, and so I took all the employees and I put them into a room together with the managers, and everyone was in the room and was kind of excited. They were looking forward to what the drill was going to be about. It was sort of that nervous energy, right? I mean, nobody gets that excited except for me. Nobody gets that excited about disaster drills. And so I figured to myself that if I'm going to get these guys excited, I need to do something different and interesting. And this is something that I've done for many, many years. So I am talking to all the employees and I was saying to them, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run this drill, which was an earthquake drill. Okay, so the scenario is going to be, this was a major earthquake. So this is a 7.0 earthquake, so something that really would rattle the buildings and really create disruption to people and their daily routines at the workplace. Makes sense. And all the managers were in the room, and I turned to them and said, the managers may not participate for the first half hour of this 2-hour drill. And the managers were shocked. They couldn't believe it because they instantly wanted to be in charge. And so I turned to the employees and I said, okay, we're going to start the drill. So let me ask you a question before we get started. Who's going to be in charge here? And they were confused because they pointed and they said, well, the managers are going to be in charge. I said, well, the managers are gone. They said, well, what do you mean the managers are gone? I said, well, the managers are gone. How are the managers gone? I said, well, one of the managers is on jury duty. One is on vacation. And one's got a kid sick home from school, and then the other two were injured. So you had an earthquake, and one of them got hit in the head with something, and then the other one was, somehow incapacitated. And the employees got really nervous, and I said to them, I'm asking you the most critical question in disaster preparedness, and that is, who's in charge? I'm Disaster Patrick. Thank you very much. This is my very first episode of my podcast. I'm incredibly excited about this. I'm so glad to engage with you because in this podcast, I don't do the doom and gloom thing. That's really not who I am as a disaster professional. I've been a disaster planner for over 20 years. My father was one, and I have worked with the state government. I was never a government employee, but I was a contracted employee, so I was a special consultant to the Governor's Office of Homeland Security, which is in Louisiana, right after Hurricane Katrina. And sometime I'll tell you the official story about how I got to Louisiana. It's a really fun story. It begins with a letter to the governor, and it ends up with an amazing job and an amazing opportunity. And then I left the governor's office. I went overseas. I studied in Great Britain. I came back and I became a consultant. I worked with big universities and Fortune 500 companies. And then eventually I'll open my own business working with small companies because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to solve the problem of having great disaster planning and the lack of dissemination of great disaster planning throughout all segments of our society. And I thought small businesses are wonderful. And in the last 15 years, I've been working with some of the most incredible small businesses imaginable. Restaurants, bars, nursing homes, beekeeping operations, what they call apiaries. An apiary is a bee yard, and we'll talk about bees actually in a future podcast. I have an entire episode. We're going to talk about how honeybees can actually teach us an awful lot about disaster response and disaster recovery. I also work with underwater sea cable operations. I have done so many different kinds of companies, RV parks and campgrounds. It's incredible. And so the stories that I'm going to be talking to you about, some of them are from research I've done, from books I've read, like some of the ones that are behind me here, for those of you who can see me on YouTube. I have a lot of different things that I've sort of discovered, wonderful secrets that I have found that work really well. Because when I got into disaster management, I took it the way a lot of new people do when they go into a discipline, which is they decide they're going to just listen for a long time. And that's really what I did. I listened and I just did the work the way I was told to. But eventually I said, this can be done better. It doesn't have to be top-down, difficult management where we're barking orders at people and yelling at people and throwing our uniforms and our badges and our fruit salad on our shoulder at people and saying, I'm in charge. I know what's going on. You need to do exactly as I say. And I found that is an incredibly ineffective method for disaster preparedness. So what I'm going to be talking to you about in this podcast is all about how to prepare yourself for disasters so that you never experience one. And that is a tagline I use not only here, but I use it in the videos that I create on YouTube, everywhere, because when I'm creating these videos, when I'm putting these together for you, I want to make the secrets of disaster planning available to you. There are some great techniques. There are some things that I've seen, some research that I've found, some wonderful events, things that you may say, I had no idea that had any attachment to disaster preparedness. So, for example, in a podcast, I've written out, when I was on an airplane, when I was actually deciding I was going to create this podcast, I was on an airplane, and I was thinking, I'm going to debate whether I'm actually going to do a podcast or not. And the only way I'm going to know if I really want to do a podcast, the only way I'm going to know is if I can actually create enough podcast ideas to last me, say, 3 or 4 months. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to sit here and look out the window and just start writing out podcast ideas. And I came out with about 80 podcast ideas. And one of them is about Catherine the Great. She was a leader. She was actually the Tsarist of Russia. She was the Empress of Russia. And she was one of the people who was one of the seminal characters in the history of Russia. And she lived in the 18th century. And there are some lessons and some things that she did during her time that actually extrapolate some incredible lessons for us today in disaster preparedness. So those are some of the things we'll talk about. Some of the sometimes we'll talk about some of the more dramatic disaster examples. Obviously, the Titanic is the obvious one, but there's other ones like you can see here. There's a book behind me. It says Triangle, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire that occurred in the early 20th century. That was a massive destructive fire that killed a lot of people. And so just because I don't make it doom and gloom, that doesn't mean we can't tackle difficult topics, because we're going to. This is not Pollyanna. We're not going to take a fresh off the turnip truck approach. What I'm going to do is talk to you about how these little things can be utilized and incorporated into your daily routines. This is not a typical survivalist style podcast. We're going to talk about the prepper lifestyle, but what I want you to do is I want you to take that lifestyle and I want you to incorporate that into some of the things that we do for those of us who live in an urban or a suburban environment. And that's one of the things that I do. So, for example, I live in Sacramento, California, and I've lived all over the country. I've lived in the Deep South. I've lived in the East Coast. I've lived in the North. I've lived everywhere. And I've lived in other countries. I've lived in Asia. I've lived in Europe. And everywhere I go, there are just little secrets and things that I've learned and discovered, and just proven things that I really want to share with you, because I feel like if you just incorporate a few of the things that I talk about, we together can really make a major difference. The reason why I got into disaster preparedness in the first place is because I was watching the television, and this was during Hurricane Katrina, and I noticed the incredible civil disruption that was going on in New Orleans and Baton Rouge and surrounding areas, and I said, the most powerful country in the history of the world, with all of our physical technologies, all our management technologies, the way we've designed our government, everything, and this is the best that we can come up with disaster preparedness. This is the best that we can do. And I said, there's got to be a better way, and there is a better way of doing it. And so what I'm hoping is you listen to these podcasts, that what I provide you is a better approach to disaster preparedness. So let me get back to that original question I was telling you about. In that room with those 75 employees, I asked them, who's in charge? And when I say who's in charge, I really mean it. We have to ask ourselves who's in charge. That is the most important question in a disaster response. It's not even close. I mean, there isn't like, well, if that's first, well, there's a close second. No, there's not a close second. That is number one. The second most important question is one that's a distant second. I'll actually teach you and I'll tell you what that second question is, because I know what that question is also. But knowing who is in charge at all times is seminal, because if you don't know who's in charge, then what happens is you get this wide dissemination where activities can't occur, authority doesn't exist, communication breaks down, and therefore tasks are not completed. And you remember earlier I was mentioning about Hurricane Katrina, and I was mentioning the fact that we don't need to have somebody in a uniform, barking orders at us all the time. Do this, do that, do this, do that. It doesn't have to be that. But what it does have to do is whenever we are engaging ourselves in a disaster response, we have to ask ourselves at all times, who is in charge? And the answer is not going to be as easy as you think. And the answer is not as simple as you think. Because you may think, well, clearly this guy is getting me to say, me. And that's part of it. That's part of it. Sure. Yeah, I want to say it's you, because it is you. It is you. At all times, it is you. But it's a little bit more of a gray area than that. So it's a little more complex. So I want to kind of talk to you through that decision-making process, because in a disaster response, you're going to be answering that question over and over and over again. In future podcasts, I'm going to talk to you about equipment. I'm going to talk to you about supplies. I'm going to talk to you about technology. I'm going to talk to you about disaster recovery. I'm going to talk to you about drones. I'm going to talk to you about the government. I'm going to talk to you about FEMA. I'm going to talk to you about emergency alerts. I'm going to talk to you about belligerent activity. I'm going to talk to you about security teams. I'm going to talk to you about information technology, cyber attacks. We're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about black widow spiders that find their way into those ubiquitous red backpacks, because I have a story about that I can't wait to tell you, and it will really give you a good idea about it. So that's probably about a dozen podcasts ahead. But there's so many different things that are going that kind of pull us in these directions. But what I'd say to people is, I say, in the end, you have to center yourself by saying, who's in charge? And when I talk to you about equipment, when I talk to you about supplies, when I talk to you about technology, and we discuss these things together, what you will find is I am constantly asking us, I'm constantly asking the question, who's in charge? Who's in charge? And it's not as simple as you think. So there's one of the elements that we have to deal with in regards to dealing with outside agencies, so dealing with the fire department, dealing with the police department. So these are all things that we will definitely talk about. So let me kind of give it to you a little bit. Let me kind of give you a few points to consider as we think about this. The first is, when we talk about who's in charge, the question really relies on responsibility and authority and being able to make decisions. Whenever I tell people about this philosophy that I have and this question that I pose, inevitably people say, well, wait a minute, if my house is burning down, I'm not in charge. The fire department's in charge. The ambulance is in charge for the people who are victims, all that. And the answer I would tell you is that actually they're not. They're not. The ultimate decision-making authority rests with you. The ultimate decision-making authority to call 911 is you, unless someone else calls. And then you could still say to the fire department, don't come here. I could give you right now, without even, pulling up Google or picking up a piece of paper or a pencil, I could give you 5 scenarios right now, 5 things that you could do that if the fire department were called out by someone else, the fire department shows up, if you did one of these 5 things, they would leave. They would leave immediately. Now, what they might do is they might put water down on a neighbor's house because they don't want the fire to spread. That they may do, but in the end, a lot of it is you. So, for example, when I was an EMS professional, and it's actually how I started my time in emergency response. In a future podcast, I'll be talking to you in depth about my background. But you will hear throughout these podcasts, I pepper these stories with my time as an EMS guy working on an ambulance. And actually, a lot of really interesting things happened while I worked on an ambulance. But when you are an EMT and you're on the street, you're taught one thing. Scene safety is important, and we'll talk about scene safety some other time. But if you are somehow able to make the scene unsafe, and there are ways of doing that, you could make the scene artificially unsafe, the fire department wouldn't come in. They would wait until that part of the scene was safe before they came in. I know that seems strange, but that does happen, and there are ways of doing that. I'm not saying to do that. In fact, don't do that. But what I am saying is that in the end, this decision-making authority is up to you. In the end, the decision-making authority for how you want your house, house made safe, that ultimately is up to you. If you just want it to burn down, it can just burn down. There are ways of, as I said, there are ways of preventing first responders from getting to you so that you could allow it to burn down. Again, you're not saying, and I'm not advocating for that, but I'm telling you, you do maintain that control. So where does a fire department, where does the ambulances, where does law enforcement fit when we call 911 and they come? Well, they're on your team. Think of them as like a team member. So like, like on a football team, for example, the quarterback can't do everything. The wide receivers can't do everything. The coaches can't do everything, right? Every single person has a role that they play. The defensive end is not the quarterback. He doesn't have to throw the ball. The quarterback is not going to be the defensive end because he'd be run over probably. So there's no point to putting him in that position. But the quarterback really, in the end, has the decision-making authority of what's going to happen around him. He has to understand, and that's what really effective quarterbacks do in leadership. And we know that because when we watch sports teams, we are able to laud, great quarterbacks or great leaders on the field, whether it's soccer or, on the soccer pitch, or it's on the baseball diamond, or it's on the gridiron, or it's on the basketball court. Everywhere we look to certain sports figures and say, that person's a really great leader. And they empower us to greatness. So think about the fire department and them as empowering you to be more successful, because they're able to conduct certain activities that you simply can't do. There are certain actions that you simply can't do yourself. And so they act as an augmentation, and they are there to be able to assist you in those ways. Even when we talk about government agencies, and I'll talk about them again in future podcasts, they also have a place. They have something that they do for you to augment what you are doing and augment your disaster response. But remember, they're not in charge. We have to remember that they are not in charge. In the end, we are in charge. We choose to engage with FEMA. We choose to have the fire department come to our home. We choose to be rescued or not. We choose whether to drive through floodwaters. We choose the kind of technologies we're going to use. We choose to have red backpacks that are old and dusty and don't work. And trust me, the next podcast we're going to be talking about that, and that'll be really interesting. But when we don't get involved, we don't take that initial authority ourselves, that is a very serious problem. I go to business leaders all the time and I say, if there's a disaster, who's in charge? And they say, I am. And then I go to employees and I say, well, who's in charge in a disaster? And they say, well, CEO so-and-so, or, manager so-and-so. And I say, what happens if the managers are gone and they get totally flustered? Really well-run companies too, really well-run businesses that say, I don't know what to do if so-and-so isn't in the room. And so we have to find mechanisms, managerial and engineering and all those things that actually allow and provide employees with the ability to be able to act on the disaster program. So when I was talking about it, that initial scenario, that initial presentation, the training I was doing with that drill at that business, I said to them, managers aren't here, so it's all you. So what are you going to do? And so what I did was they were still standing around talking among themselves, and I looked in the very back of the room, and I found the person who was trying to avoid my gaze. She was looking away, doing everything she could to not be identified by me at all. And I said, hi, I want you to come on up to the front. I want you to come to the front. She was clearly nervous. She was wondering why I was asking her, of all people, to come to the front. And I said, you're going to be in charge for the first half hour. You're going to be in charge for the first half hour. And she would say, why me? I said, well, how long have you been at the company? She goes, well, I was trying to avoid your gaze because I've really only been to business for like a couple of weeks. And some of the employees were saying she's the newest employee in the room. She hadn't been here for very long. And I said, fantastic. That's exactly what I wanted. I was trying to find the person in the room with the least experience, with the least knowledge, and had no idea what was going on. And that's the person I'm going to put in charge. You would ask, why would I do that? Because at a business, they're going to have certain protocols and procedures and policies and things. So they'll have, traditionally a disaster plan. They'll have, disaster equipment and supplies, and there's emergency communication technologies and things. But they all have to be galvanized. They all have to be organized together, and the plan does that. And I'm going to talk to you about how, in a lot of ways, disaster plans are only for a narrow set of institutions, that not everyone has to have one. And that's an incredibly unpopular opinion in my discipline, but I've been doing it for a long time. I go to families and say, listen, you don't necessarily have to have a disaster plan. You don't have to have one. That's not a terribly popular opinion among emergency management professionals, because that's the standard in our industry. We say, well, we're going to have a disaster plan and therefore we're going to build it. And we'll talk about that, and I'll be able to talk with you about exactly how important the disaster plan is or isn't in your disaster response, and what are really good disaster plans and what are really bad disaster plans. There are both. Trust me, I've written thousands of them. One of the things I say with businesses is there is no such thing as disaster response by committee. We don't do disaster response by committee. And why do we not do disaster response by committee? We don't do disaster response by committee because we can't have groups of people who are trying to make decisions collectively where they all say, we as a group are going to be in charge. Because sometimes businesses do that to try to skirt what I tell them, saying one person has to be in charge. They skirt that by saying, well, we're just going to take 4 or 5 really top people and they're going to decide among themselves. Then what happens is time gets wasted. Decisions don't get made. Tasks that should only take a few minutes all of a sudden take 30 minutes or an hour to do. And there's not clear authority, so people get confused. Then there's chaos. Then people start to leave. The response will collapse. This happens also with families. I'll work with families. I work with families all the time. And when I talk with them and I say, who's in charge? They always say, dad or mom or whomever. And I say, the kids, what if you're home and your parents aren't here? Or what if you have a disaster at school? Or what if you have a disaster when you're on your way home? And they don't feel as though they've been given the authority, and they don't have the ability, and they don't have the tools to be effective disaster responders by themselves. But one of the things that we're going to do together, and what we are going to explore in this podcast series, is how we can ensure that everybody can be successful in a disaster. Because I define disasters differently than everyone else, and I'm going to tell you what that definition is. A disaster is when an event, a disruptive event, makes you weaker. That's what a disaster is. And I'm not going to get too much into it because in a future podcast, I'm going to just talk to you about what is a disaster. But when a disaster makes you stronger afterwards, when you're more resilient after the disaster occurs, all of a sudden, the disaster didn't happen at all. That's what I tell people. The disaster may have happened outside, but you know what? The disaster didn't happen to you. It may have been a disaster, but it wasn't a disaster to you. That's why I tell people, prepare for disasters and you'll never experience one, because you're going to put yourself in a position where you are going to be stronger and better afterwards. But it all starts with thinking and considering who's going to be in charge, who's going to be accountable, who's going to make those decisions. Because if you don't do that, if you don't make those decisions early on, if you don't think those through, then what happens is it becomes a chaotic mess. I could give you a dozen examples right now of times where things became a chaotic mess. I think Hurricane Katrina is a great example, and I'm careful about that because I know Louisianans these days are very sensitive about Katrina because they feel like they've been beat up about it over the years. And I was a Louisianan for years because I lived there, and I totally understand. But I don't want to belabor it too much. But what I do want to say is that one of the great lessons that came out of it, so out of that great disaster, one of the things that came out of it was an unbelievable lesson that from a situation where civil society is essentially displaced by a natural event, can we put ourselves in a position where we are stronger afterwards? And you know what? Katrina allowed us all to do that, because it gave us this lesson where we now, if we incorporate this into our daily preparedness, I don't care if you work for a business, I don't care if you run a business, I don't care if you work for someone else, you work for a school, if you're a teacher, if you're a student, if you're someone who's unemployed, you're someone who's vulnerable, you can get something out of this podcast, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the critical tools, and I'm going to reveal to you these great secrets and proven techniques that I've utilized over the years to develop a great resiliency with the businesses that I work with. And I want you to have those tools, because then whenever you're experiencing a disruptive event, you are actually disrupting the disaster. That's why I call this podcast Disrupting Disaster, because I want you to disrupt that process of that natural event that is going to try to make you weaker. I want you to disrupt that, and I want you to transform it into a situation that makes you stronger and more effective. This is not just, I'm not just some motivational speaker that's just telling you this and saying, I want you to be stronger no matter what. And that, don't worry, use every single thing I say and you'll be fine. No, I'm not trying to do that to you, and this isn't fake, this isn't an affectation. These are real techniques that I've utilized in the real world, and things that I've seen utilized effectively. So, is it going to be applicable to every situation? There are techniques I'm going to show you, and things that I'm going to be telling you, and ideas that I'm going to pose to you that may not be directly applicable to you. That's very possible. But what I do want you to do is take those techniques and say, how can I best apply them to me? How can I best apply what I'm hearing to a daily disaster response? Because in the end, you will find, I'm going to go back to that room. When you're running a drill, when you're running an earthquake drill, and you noticed I didn't even talk about the drill today. I didn't talk to you about it at all, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how the drill went. But by the way, I will tell you at some point how the drill went. But it doesn't matter how the drill went. What matters to us who are trying to develop really great disaster techniques, those of us who are disaster professionals, it's interesting to note that these drills can tell us an awful lot if we allow ourselves to. And so for me, the way I want you to think about that drill and what I want you to think about that story is, if you don't go back to that original question, who's in charge, then the rest of the disaster response will never make a difference. And in our next podcast, I'm going to actually pose the most important question in disaster management. And the next time, I'm going to be talking to you about those red backpacks, because in a lot of ways, people surrender and say, when they ask who should be in charge, their answer is the dusty red backpack that sits in the corner. This is Disaster Patrick, and remember, prepare for a disaster, and you'll never experience one. See you next time.